Well, good morning, friends. How you doing? Good to see you all out here on a Sunday morning. Beautiful, beautiful autumn that we're having. My gosh, it is glorious. No better place to be than Steamboat in September. Or now, is it October yet officially? Close. Tomorrow or today? Tomorrow. All right, whatever. But great to be here. Great to have you. My name is Troy. I'm one of our pastors here, and glad to have you here in person. Also, those who are watching online, thanks for joining us. And it's great to have you here, Rachel, representing SELA, which is an organization that's near and dear heart to our church. We have been supporting them for 20 years. And I'll tell you, I believe God has blessed this church because of our partnership and our investment in the unborn and in ladies who are in trouble and looking for hope and finding it there at SELA. So thank you for what you do. And all of you who volunteer, Tanya, thanks for being on the board and helping this great organization. I encourage you today to get involved, to either go and give or maybe volunteer. Or if you are looking to, maybe you'd like to go to that banquet on the 13th, Julie and I sponsored a table. We have a couple of seats. We'd love to have you as our guests. And so let me know afterwards and I'll buy you dinner. When was the last time your pastor bought you dinner? Never, I know. So anyway, I'd love to do that with you and share that. Every time we go to the banquet, I always end up crying. I hear amazing stories of God's providence and love, so I hope you can make it. Well, today we are ending our series that we started on the family. It's called The Perfect Family. Of course, as you know, there is no such thing as a perfect family, but we're trying. And as we end today, this series, I want to try to stretch your thinking a little bit about family, okay? We're closing this all up. We're kind of wrapping it up, and so I'm going to kind of do a little different thing today, and I just hope that you hang with me. But one of the things I want to do is get you to think a little differently about family. As Westerners, we generally think about our immediate family. In other words, if I was to come and you say, hey, tell me about your family, you would probably say, as an American, I'll tell you about my wife or my husband or my son or my daughter. But in the rest of the world, when you travel other places, I've been to Africa, Europe, you'll run into people, and they're just as likely to tell you about their extended family as they are their immediate family. They would tell you about their grandparents or perhaps their great-grandparents. They might tell you about where their grandfather came from or their great-grandfather came from or what he did for a living. There just seems to be a much bigger appreciation for previous generations in those cultures than ours. We focus more on our immediate family, and it's probably to our detriment a little bit on that. In fact, here's something that you probably don't think about and have never thought about, perhaps, and that is this, is that someday you are going to be someone's previous generation. Someday, somebody's going to look back and remember you and what you did. Someone's going to say, I remember I had a great aunt and she was a crack up, man. She made us laugh all the time. Or my grandpappy, he was awesome. He was so cool. Every time he came and visited us, he brought me a gift or brought us some candy or something like that. Or maybe they would say, our great grandmother was a key player in our family. She kind of helped hold things together for our family when things were falling apart. And these statements will all be talking about you from back in the day, right? I know this personally, that my extended family has had a big impact on my life. I didn't think about it early on, but the older I've gotten, I can see their touch in my life and how it's changed my life. I've told you this before, that I was born here in Steamboat Springs. I'm one of the few legit natives, man. I've been here from the beginning, and I'm proud of that. But the circumstances on which caused me to be born here are a little funky. They're a little strange. But as I look at it, there's no doubt that my extended family affected my life, affected the trajectory of my life. My mom, when she was younger, she got married to a man who was probably not ready to be married. He was in college, and he was really enjoying the college life, and so during their first year of marriage, he hardly ever came home. He was out partying with his bros and drinking and all of that, and when he did come home, they would often argue, and on a few occasions, he got physically abusive with her. And my mom was young, and she was pregnant, and she decided that she could not do this, and so she decided to leave. But she didn't know where to go. And it was a kind of a desperate time in her life. And so she happened to call a trusted aunt of hers to get some advice. And the lady that she called was a lady by the name of Elaine Gay. Elaine is my great aunt, and her husband Bob homesteaded and lived on a ranch. You may be familiar here in Steamboat of the Green Creek Ranch over in Pleasant Valley. Been there for 120, 130 years. And they invited my mom in her situation to come from Evergreen, Colorado, to come over and live with them. They had a bunkhouse where they normally had some of their cowboys and wranglers that would come and stay with them. It was available, and so we moved into that. A few months later, I was born here in the Steamboat Hospital. And the first few months of my life, I lived here in Steamboat. After several months, or after a period of time, my mom then divorced this guy, and then she moved back to Denver. But my great aunt and great aunt uncle were always near and dear to my mom's heart because of the kindness that they showed her. And we would often come visit them here in Steamboat. And so growing up, I have a lot of memories of sitting at their dinner table at this ranch house that's still there. And they would share stories about how our family came to Steamboat 100 years ago. It blew my mind. Turn of the century, around the late 1800s, our family came from Kansas, and I remember hearing stories about how our family came over Rabbit Ears Pass in a wagon, a covered wagon, and how hard life was here in Steamboat, especially during the winters. They told stories about my grandmother, who was a teacher, who taught in one of these little one-room schoolhouses that you see sprinkled all over the valley. And so I was fascinated by these stories, and by these stories of courage and of perseverance in difficult times. And during that early years, I began to dream of maybe the hope of someday, perhaps maybe I could live here in the Yampa Valley. There was something deep roots-wise to me here. And so fast forward 40 years later, Julie and I were youth pastors in San Diego, California, and we heard about a church here in Steamboat that was looking for a new pastor. And so we quickly applied, and through just some cool things, God opened the door for us to be able to come back and live in our dream place. In fact, this was one of the most attractive things that Julie found about me. Some of you wondered, what does she see in him? When we first met, I told her I was from Steamboat Springs. She's like, Steamboat Springs? That's my favorite place in the world. And so that's how I got hooked up right there. Steamboat was pretty good for me. Consequently, a previous generation's courage and kindness to me paved the way for my life to be changed, I think, in many ways. It could have been a difficult situation, and they made it easy. And so I am forever grateful to my extended family here in Steamboat. And here's my point. The family that comes after you, okay, the family that's coming down the road, your kids, or maybe your grandkids, or your nieces, or your nephews, or in my case, your great-nephews, they will become who they are in large part based on your influence. I don't want you to overlook this, that your presence in their life, your example in their life can really change their life. You and I, again, we don't think about this much, you and I have a future family. There's a family that's coming 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And you and I are currently making a mark on that family by the choices and the decisions that we're making now. I know we live in the present, and we're very worried about the present, but some of what we do is having eternal consequences. In fact, in other words, our actions don't just speak louder than words. They sometimes echo into the next generation. Our example is speaking to that next generation. Our actions can literally change the future of some of our future generations, our future family. And I want you to think about that a little bit as we kind of close this series and wrap this up. And one of the best examples of this truth comes from the Bible. I told you at the beginning of this series that there isn't a lot of great examples of good families in the Bible. They are jacked up. There's a lot of bad examples. People will say, hey, I want to have a biblical family. And I will go, which family in the Bible would you want to emulate? Because they are all dysfunctional and a little wacky. I mean, there's some crazy stuff in this book. I don't know if you read it, man. It's PG-13 at least in some of that stuff. But there is one story that is so inspiring and so remarkable that I thought it would be worth looking at here today as we close this series. The challenge with this story, and you probably heard parts of it, but the challenge with this story is that it developed over different generations, over about 60 years. Of a couple different generations. And so subsequently, it's hard for you and I to connect the dots between what's going on here. You all are probably very familiar with the second part of this story, the latter part of this story, but I'll bet you've never heard the first part. Or if you have heard it, you never connected the dots between the two things and what actually was happening. If you're not a church person, it's likely that this is all new to you. But this story is so good that I think you'll enjoy it, and I think you'll be challenged and maybe amazed by it. The story starts in the second part of the book of Genesis. Many of you are maybe familiar with that. This happens after the creation account and after the great flood and all those other things that you may or may not believe happened. This is about a family. It begins with the family, one of the most famous families that ever lived. In fact, almost every religious person in the world knows about this family and is connected to this family. It begins with the family of Abraham, if you'll put up the family tree there. It starts with the family of Abraham, and Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac was the promised one, and then Isaac had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Now, they were twins. And this is an interesting thing. Esau was the first one that came out of the womb. He was the firstborn, which was super important back then. The firstborn had lots of advantages over his brothers and sisters. Basically, they were going to get a double share of the inheritance from the father, and they would become the judge of the family. When the patriarch died, the firstborn instantly became kind of the rule maker and the power broker for the whole family. And so Esau, this is important, he was the firstborn, and Jacob came second. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But Jacob, as you may know, had 12 sons. He had a lot of sons. They became eventually known as the 12 tribes of Israel. You're now connecting those dots, right? But and you may know some of those names, Reuben, a couple of other weird names. But the one that is most famous of his sons was Joseph. And most of us are familiar with Joseph and the Technicolor, coat and robe and all that. We're familiar with his story a little bit. Joseph's story is so awesome. It's one of my favorite in the Bible, and it's one that most of us are familiar with. But with your permission today, I want to tell it to you. I want to share you with his story a little bit with you. And I want to make a point, and I hope that you'll hang with me as I walk through this story, because I think it'll bless you at the end, okay? Are you willing to do that? All right, I'm going to do it whether you are or not, but here we go, all right? Hopefully this will be interesting. When Joseph was 17 years old, he recognized and discovered that his brothers hated him. He figured out kind of quickly that they did not like him. Now, they hated him for two big reasons. Number one, his father had made no secret of the fact that Joseph was his favorite son. It's a bad move by Jacob, man, to let everyone know. He had no problem telling everybody, this is my boy, I love him, he gave him a coat, he really doted on him. And the reason that Joseph was his favorite son was because Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife. Joseph had several wives, so isn't this something, right? So Jacob had several wives. Jacob would go to one wife and say, I want you to know you are my favorite wife. And she's like, wow, that's awesome. And then he'd go over here and go, dear, honey, you are my second favorite wife. And she's like, oh, wow. Then he goes to the third one, you are my third favorite wife. And she's like, goody for me, right? I mean, this is dysfunction junction, man. This is crazy, crazy stuff that's happening. And so Joseph was the favorite, and everybody knew it, and he was despised for that. The second reason that they hated Joseph was that Joseph had a dream one day, and this dream impacted him. It was kind of intense, and so he told his brothers about this dream, and the dream was this, that one day in the future, his brothers, in his dream, were bowing down before Joseph. So he's like the youngest son, and all of his brothers are bowing down. And as you can imagine, these guys were not too excited to hear this story. They didn't go over well with him, and they despised him for this dream that he told them. And so, one day, Jacob tells Joseph to go check on his brothers. Apparently these boys were always up to no good, and as in most families, the youngest is kind of the spy, so he sends the young one out to go spy on them, and when Joseph gets to where they're supposed to be, of course they're not there, so he goes looking for them, and he finds them in some place that they're not supposed to be. And when they see Joseph coming, they're like, oh, great, here comes that rat-fink brother of ours, here comes the dreamer, dream boy, whatever. And so they're pretty bummed out about that. And as he walks towards them, one of the brothers comes up with an idea. He's like, you know what we ought to do? We ought to kill this monkey. We ought to take him out. He has been nothing but trouble for us. I don't like him. You don't like him. We ought to kill him. And brothers like that. But one of the older brothers suggested it might be better to just beat him up and then sell him into slavery, and then just maybe tell their father that he was killed by a wild animal. And all the other brothers are like, "Ooh, this is a great idea. First of all, we get to punch him, and we get to weld on him, which we want to do. I've been wanting to give that guy a noogie. I want to hit him hard. And then we can make a little cash on the side, which is good, and Dad will never know the difference." And so Joseph shows up, and they jump him. They start wailing on him, kicking him, beating him up, and then they wipe him out and they throw him into a cistern, a well or a pit. And soon after that, they sell him to some slave traders who were on their way by, who were traveling by. And so then they go home and they tell their father, "Oh, Dad, Joseph is missing. We went looking for him everywhere. We couldn't find him. What we did find was his robe, and it was covered in blood." It was, a lot of it looks like it's Joseph's blood, but some of this looks like an animal's blood as well. And it looks like there was this terrible struggle. It's all tore up. Joseph must have put up a good fight. But Dad, your favorite son from your favorite wife is clearly dead and gone. And Jacob was devastated by this news. It broke his heart. Well, meanwhile, while this is happening, Joseph is traveling on his way to Egypt to become a slave. Now, you and I, when we read the Bible, we often skip over passages like this without really thinking about the emotional component of it. We often romanticize what's happening, and it's hard for us to comprehend how miserable and how terrible this must have been. Here's this 17-year-old boy who is shackled and chained up, walking behind a camel as he's being dragged across the desert. And he is afraid. He has no idea what's in store for him. But he knows it's probably not going to be any good. Pardon me. And so somehow Joseph survives this trek across the desert to Egypt. And when he gets to Egypt, he's sold to a guy by the name of Potiphar. Now, this is actually kind of maybe a blessing in disguise. Potiphar was a very powerful man. In fact, he was the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh of Egypt. He was kind of the captain of the guard for the king. And so Joseph moves in to Potiphar's house. And when he moves into Potiphar's house, you and I learned something interesting about Joseph. Think about this. Joseph apparently has decided to live his life as if God was with him and for him, even though it appeared that God had completely abandoned him. Joseph had made a decision in his heart that I'm going to try to live my life as if God was for me, even though all the evidence otherwise was proving that it looked like God had kicked me to the curb. And that was the way he lived his life. At every turn in Joseph's life, we see Joseph choosing to do the right thing. And even though the right thing never happened to him, it never really paid off for him. It just seemed like it was always just this one series of bad events after another. And so Joseph moves into Potiphar's house, and he works hard. He works as if everything's okay. He's not in a great situation, but he works hard, and Potiphar has favor upon him, and he puts him in charge of his entire household, right? But at the same time, Joseph kind of attracts the attention of Potiphar's wife, who thinks that he's good looking, and so she corners him, and she's like, "Hey, bro, I want you to be my little pool boy. Is that cool with you?" And he's like, no. He's like, "I could never do something like that. I would never dishonor my master in such a way. My master, your husband. I would never do that. And, by the way, I would never dishonor my God in such a way." To which you and I might say, time out, Joseph. Which God is that? Is this the same God that allowed you to get beat up and sold into slavery and have your life derailed? Is this the same God that had you sold into slavery? That's the God that you don't want to dishonor, that one? But Joseph had decided in his heart to do the right thing, always, regardless. And so Potiphar's wife, since she was rebuffed, she accused him of rape. And Potiphar had no choice but to believe her, and so he puts Joseph in prison. And so think about this. Joseph was a favored son in the house. He's loved by his dad, and then Joseph becomes a slave. And now Joseph has been put into a dungeon. I mean, it was bad enough being a slave, and now he is in a dungeon, which is really, really bad. Because when you're in a dungeon, you're not just waiting for your court date to show up. You're not just waiting for that time to stand before a judge. You're not waiting for an appeal. You're not waiting for a last-minute pardon to come in from the governor or anything like that. If you're in a dungeon, you're there for the rest of your life. It's over. My point being is that Joseph is barely 21 years old, and with so much hope and promise, and now his life is essentially over. And yet, once again, we find Joseph continuing to live his life as if God was with him, as if God was for him, and God wanted to bless him, even though it seemed as though God had totally ditched him. And so he works hard in the prison, and he tries to be faithful, even though he's in a disaster. And in fact, Genesis 39, verse 21, we read this very strange verse that describes Joseph's situation. It says this, that the Lord was with him. Oh, really? That's good. And God showed him kindness. Oh, that's good too, right? And God granted him favor. Wow, this is wonderful. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Oh, goody. I mean, if God is with you, you really shouldn't have a personal relationship with a prison warden, right? That's not something that you're like, oh, this is a good thing. My best buddy is a prison warden. He sees potential in me. That's not as if God is blessing you, right? Again, Joseph is living in this tension between the good news, God is with me, and the reality, I'm stuck in this dungeon. I'm stuck in this pit, and my life seems to be over. And yet, Joseph continues to trust God, even though it appears that God has abandoned him. And so, time goes on, and time goes on as he's in this dungeon. And eventually, Pharaoh gets angry with a couple of his servants, and he throws them into the dungeon. And they meet Joseph, and they become friends. And both of them have dreams, and Joseph has the ability to interpret these dreams. He tells them what they mean. And one of the servants was the cupbearer for the Pharaoh. In other words, he brought his wine and did all this stuff for him. And Joseph tells him, hey, listen, your dream means that one day, very soon, you're going to be restored back to Pharaoh. You're going to be pulled out of here, and you're going to be restored back to your position. And the cupbearer's like, wow, that is such good news, man. That's awesome. Joseph said, listen, would you do me one favor, man? Would you remember me when you get out of this place? Would you just remember me? Because I don't think anybody in the world knows that I'm here or anyone cares. Would you just remember me and maybe somehow mention me or somehow just remember me? And the cupbearer's like, deal, I'll do it. And sure enough, the dream comes true, and the cupbearer gets restored back to Pharaoh's court. But of course, this guy forgets Joseph. He just totally forgets him and never mentions him to Pharaoh. And so 2 more years pass, and nothing changes. Joseph is still rotting away in this prison cell. Life is just brutal to this kid. And then one day, the Pharaoh himself has a dream. And he's troubled by this dream, and he wants to know what it means. And so he needs an interpreter. And the cupbearer's like, oh, wait a second. Excuse me, Pharaoh, but remember a couple years ago when you and I had that little spat between each other and you threw me in the dungeon? By the way, you were totally justified in that. But anyway, there is this guy down there in the dungeon named Joseph. And this guy interpreted this dream that I had, and it totally came true. He was right. Maybe he can help you. And within 1 hour, Joseph is cleaned up, and he is standing in front of the most powerful man in the world. And the Pharaoh looks at him and he says, young man, I have heard some stories about you and how the gods are with you and that how you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says something totally dumb. He's like, no, I can't interpret dreams. But my God, the one true God, perhaps he can interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Everybody in the room kind of holds their breath because Pharaoh was seen as a god. And so Joseph just kind of kicked him in the shin. And Pharaoh hears this, and he's like, listen, I am so desperate to know what this dream means. I'm going to totally ignore the dumb thing that you just said, and I just want you to tell me what this dream is about. And so Joseph tells him. He says, this dream means that for the next 7 years, Egypt is going to have one great harvest after another. I mean, it's going to be a time of plenty. It's just Egypt is going to be so blessed over the next 7 years. But 7 years from now, a terrible famine is going to hit this land, and it's going to last for 7 years. And that famine is going to be so bad that the entire economy of this great nation and of the region is going to be totally and completely destroyed. So Pharaoh hears this, and as he's mulling this over, Joseph gets even bolder. He says, you know what? I was thinking about this. You're probably going to need someone very wise to help you navigate this situation that's about to happen. You would probably do well to I would think that it would be good for you to build these big giant grain silos in every one of Egypt's cities and all the big cities in Egypt, to build these big grain silos. And that maybe you should probably tax people like 20% of their grain, and that you store that grain and hold on to it so that when the famine hits, you could sell all of that grain and you will make Egypt incredibly wealthy. Pharaoh hears this and he's like, Joe, you're my man. You are now in charge of this whole operation. In fact, there will be no one greater than you in this land. From now on, anything you say, it will be as if I myself am saying that. And on that day, Joseph, this kid whose life was a disaster, becomes the prime minister of Egypt, the second most powerful person in the world. And Joseph immediately goes to work. And sure enough, as he predicted, there are several years of bountiful harvests that come in. And he stores up the grain, right? And he holds on to it. And then 7 years later, just as he promised, a famine hits. And no one can grow anything. I mean, the world is desperate. And people from all over the world begin to travel down to Egypt so that they can buy food because they've heard that there is grain in Egypt. And in fact, Genesis 42, verse 5, tells us a little bit about it. It says this: so Israel's sons. Israel is actually Jacob. Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel. That's how we got that name. He says, so Israel sent his 11 boys, who were among those who went down to buy grain, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan as well. Go on here, if you would. It says, Joseph, now at this time, one of the sons, right, was now governor of the entire land. He's the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, get this, they bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. And as soon as Joseph saw them, he recognized them. These are the dudes. These are the guys. Now, it's interesting. They didn't recognize Joseph because he kind of walked like an Egyptian and talked like an Egyptian. He had look at it. They didn't recognize him, but he instantly recognized them. Now, here's my point. Joseph at this time is 39 years old. It has been 22 years since he last saw these turkeys, right? And here they are now, all in a row, bowing down before him. And Joseph remembers, as he looks at him, he remembers the terror that he felt as a young boy when these guys just ganged up on him and beat him up and threw him into a pit. He remembers their voices from the bottom of that pit as they talked and plotted his death. He remembers their laughter and their smiles as they sold him into slavery. He remembers the clinking sound of the coins as they gave them money for him to be a slave. And more than that, Joseph remembers all of those years sitting in that dungeon, believing that he would never get out of there. I mean, he remembers all of that misery, all of those years of misery. You see, Joseph had no idea how this story would end up. He didn't have an Old Testament. We know the story, but he didn't know. He had no idea that 4,000 years later, we would still be talking about his story because it's so wonderful. But there he was, the second most powerful person in the world, and there they were, his brothers, who caused all of that, bowing down before him with their destiny in his hands. He had all the power. Suddenly, Joseph connects the dots. He puts it together. He has this thought. And this is the part of the story that most people rarely get when they read this story and that we forget. But the reason is because you've got to rewind and go back several pages. You've got to go back many, many years, back to when Abraham, Isaac, and Esau and Jacob were living. Specifically, you got to go back to when Esau and Jacob were teenagers, when Esau and Jacob were brothers and they were teenagers. And even though that they were twins, it's interesting, they were two entirely different people with two different interests. Esau was a woodsman, and he was hairy, and he was just a wild man, and he loved to go out hunting and fishing. That was his thing. Jacob was more of a homebody. He liked to stay at home and maybe even do some cooking. That was kind of his gig. And Genesis tells us, the story tells us that one day after Esau had been out hunting for several days and came home empty-handed, he came and he was extremely hungry when he walked into the house. And Jacob had been sitting there cooking some stew. And when Esau smells it, he's like, oh man, I am so hungry. I've got to have some of your stew. Please give me some of your stew or I will die. And Jacob recognizes that this is one of those rare moments that very rarely comes to a younger brother. See, younger brothers hardly ever have something that the older brothers want. It's usually the other way around, right? The younger brothers want what the older one. But now he recognizes that maybe opportunity is knocking here, and so he aims high with his negotiations. He says, hey, sure, I'll give you a bowl of my stew in exchange for your birthright. Here's a bowl of stew. I want your birthright. In other words, for this little bowl of stew, which is a yummy stew, it's delish. Everything that you're going to get from our father when he dies, you got to give to me. Apparently, Esau's frontal lobes have not fully developed at this point because he's like, oh, deal, I'll take it. And he takes the deal. And in fact, the Bible says this. It says that Esau despised his birthright for a bowl of stew. How many times have you and I in our life traded something incredibly valuable for something that means nothing? And so he did it. And about a year or two goes by, and their father Isaac is now about to die. And by this time he is very old, and he is blind. He can't see, and so he then calls in his sons one by one to come into his room so that he may lay his hands on them and give them a blessing. And this is the part where he would give the firstborn son the blessing. The firstborn, the older son, would receive in this moment his share of the inheritance, and he would legally become the patriarch of the family, become in charge. And Jacob, with the help of his mother Rachel, covers his arms with fur. And his brother, like I said, was hairy. And so he sneaks into the room, this dark room, to meet with his dad. And he walks in, he's like, lowers his voice, I am Esau, and I have come now for my blessing. And Isaac hears this, and it doesn't seem right. He's a little confused. But, he's old, he doesn't know. And so he lays his hand on Jacob, and he gives Jacob the firstborn's blessing, the blessing of the firstborn. Later on, Esau comes in. He's like, I'm Esau. I've come for my blessing, Dad. And Isaac's like, uh-oh. He said, man, I have already given that blessing away. And I can only give it but once. And I gave it to the person who came in before you. As you can imagine, Esau is furious with his brother. I mean, his brother has just stolen everything from him that was rightfully his. And Esau can do nothing about it. It's done. In fact, Genesis 27:41 says this, that Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing that his father had given him. In fact, he said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near. In other words, my dad is going to die soon, and as soon as he dies, I'm going to kill my brother. I'm going to kill that monkey. When Jacob is dead, I am going to get my birthright and my power back. Well, Jacob hears about this, and he knows he's in trouble, so he runs for his life. He leaves that region, he leaves that country, and he goes off to live with an aunt and uncle. And this uncle of his has two daughters, Leah and Rachel. And Jacob likes Rachel a whole lot. He wants to marry her, but this uncle tricks Jacob, which is kind of like sowing and reaping, tricks Jacob into having to marry both of these women. And so Jacob, like I said, favors Rachel, loves her desperately, but Leah is the first to get pregnant, and she has a child. And then a little while later, Leah gets pregnant again. She has another child. And then a third time she gets pregnant, and she has a third child, and fourth, and on and on. Meanwhile, Rachel appears to be unable to conceive, and so she's desperate to have a child, so she sends in one of her maidservants with Jacob, and she gets pregnant, and she has a baby. And that's not enough, so Rachel then sends in another maidservant with this, and she gets pregnant, she has a baby. In other words, every time Jacob comes home, he either has a new wife or a new baby, man. It's just, and this happens for years, and after 20 years, Jacob now has 4 wives and 12 sons. And he's become incredibly wealthy. I mean, God has blessed him. He has lots and lots of herds. So much so that all the neighbors in that area are like, man, you've got to move. You are taking up too much resources. And in Genesis chapter 31, God speaks to Jacob. He says, then the Lord said to Jacob, I want you to go back to the land of your fathers, back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. I want you to go back to where your relatives are. And here's the thing I want you to know. I will be with you. And Jacob hears this and he thinks, God, you better be with me. You're sending me back into the lion's den. I mean, if Esau is still there, which I'm sure he is, and he sees me, he's going to want to kill me. And he will try to kill me, and he'll probably kill all of my sons. And he'll probably take my wives and take all of my herds. You better be with me, God. But in spite of these fears, he packs up his stuff, and the whole family heads out. And they start to travel across the desert. And every night when they set up their tents to camp out, Jacob's probably sitting around the fire, and he tells his wife and his children, hey guys, we need to pray because Esau probably is going to want to kill us. We need to pray because I have a feeling this is not going to end well for us. And the kids are like, why, Dad? Why would Uncle Esau want to kill us? And Jacob would have to say, well, let me tell you a story about when I was younger and what I did to your Uncle Esau. And so they travel, and finally one day they get near to the territory. And Genesis 33:1 says that Jacob looks up one day, and there was Esau coming with 400 men. Not 400 people, but 400 men. This was an army, and Jacob knew what was about to happen, and so he begins to scramble. He starts to put things. It says this, that he divides the children among Leah, who was his first wife, and then Rachel, who was his favorite wife, and the 2 servants. He breaks them up into 3 groups, and he puts the female servants and their children out in the front, and then he puts Leah and her children next, and then he puts Rachel and Joseph in the rear. Go back to that last slide. He puts Rachel and Joseph in the rear. And this is interesting. I've read this story a dozen times in my life, but I never noticed this before until recently, that Joseph is the only one of all of his sons that is mentioned by name in this account. It's interesting that he mentions Joseph, right? And so here's the interesting thing. He's got them all broken up. And it says that Jacob put Rachel and Joseph in the rear part of the caravan. And then something interesting happens. Jacob himself then steps out in front of all of them, and he begins to walk across this valley by himself. And every few steps that he goes, he'll stop, and he falls to the ground, and he bows down 7 times before Esau. And he gets back up, brushes himself off, and walks a few more steps, and then stops, and then bows down another 7 times to his brother. Over and over, all the way across this valley, Esau does this. His family, his children and his wives are watching this take place. And they see this and they can feel the tension because they know that their destiny is in the hands of this man that they've never met. But this man has every right to kill them, to kill him and to kill them all. And so they're watching this play out before them. And they're seeing this and the drama's building. And suddenly something amazing happens. Almost miraculous. It says this in verse 4, that Esau then ran out to Jacob. And when he got to Jacob, he hugged him. He embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and he kissed him. And together, these two brothers began to weep. And then after this moment of emotion, Esau looks up and he sees all these women and children that are there. And he's like, who are these that are with you? And Jacob answers, they are the children that God has graciously given to your servant. And then something interesting happens. The female servants and their children who are at the front, they approach Esau and they all bow down before him. And then Leah and her children, they come before Esau and they all bow down before him. And then last of all, it says that Joseph and Rachel came out and they bowed down before him. Again, this is the only time that one of the sons is mentioned by name. This was the story of Jacob and Esau. This was a story that Joseph had heard in the early part of his life, right? And now, in this moment, Joseph is a first-hand witness to the day that Esau, his uncle, forgave his father for being a bad man. He watches this. And he knew, in spite of all that his father had done to his uncle chose to forgive him and to reconcile with his brother. That day, his father deserved to die. But his uncle chose to give him life. It's crazy. So, with that story in your mind, I want you to flash forward now back 30 years. Joseph is now standing before his brothers. They're in Pharaoh's palace, and all of his brothers are now bowing down before him, right? And Joseph knows that he's got the power of life and death in his hands. And he remembers all that they've done to him. And in spite of all that they've done to him, Joseph chooses to do for them what his uncle did for his father. Right? Joseph chooses to follow the example, not of his dad, but of his uncle, that crazy, hairy uncle of his, who showed mercy to someone who deserved no mercy. And Joseph welcomes these brothers rather than a heavy fist, but with open arms. If you read the rest of the story, you see that Joseph breaks down and he begins to cry and he hugs on them and he weeps on them and he forgives them. And then he tells the story. He sums up all of his horrible experiences by saying to them this famous thing: what you intended to bring harm to my life, God has used to bring good. All of that crap that you did to me to try to bring evil in my life, God somehow has turned that around and made it good. And Joseph restored the relationship between him and his brothers. And he invited his whole family to move in with him in the palace. And he saved this family. He saved this family, this very important family in the history and the lineage of Jesus. Saved his family because of this one act that he emulated. The moral of the story is simple. What your children and what your grandchildren and what your nieces and what your nephews see you do may lay the groundwork for what they'll do in future times of crisis in their lives. What they see, how they see you act when the chips are down, what may affect them and change the trajectory of your family's destiny forever. You can talk all you want, mom and dad. You can preach all you want. But what your kids see you do when the odds are against you And when it's hard to be generous, or it's hard to be forgiving, or it's hard to be kind to someone who's been evil to you, when they see you do that, it will imprint something on their mind that could maybe come back and change the trajectory of your entire family forever. Why? Because our actions don't just speak louder than our words. They echo into the next generation. They have the ability to affect generations down the road. And so as we think about that, as a dad, I got to stop a little bit, and I need to think about, what the heck am I doing? Am I representing something well to my kids? Am I modeling my faith in such a way that might cause them to also, at a key point in their life, to do something? Am I modeling courage when I need to have courage to stand up for my convictions when everybody else is bailing? I got to think about, am I taking those opportunities? As a mom, am I taking opportunities to show my kids and model my faith and my hope and generosity and being kind and forgiving? Am I missing opportunities to speak that? Why? Because who knows, 10, 20, 30 years from down the road, my kid might be in a situation, and what I'm doing now and how I'm responding to our crisis in our marriage and how I'm responding to this crisis in our finances or this situation in our home, that may show up again someday, and this will maybe change the course of my family's destiny way down the road. I need to be aware of that. I need to think about it. Is there something that I should be doing differently as I think about my family? I know I'm always focused on the here and now and what am I going to do and how are we going to... But I need to think a little bit with the future. What do I need to change in my life? And am I modeling? And it's not just what I say. Am I modeling some principles that will affect my kids and my grandkids down the road? And why wouldn't I change some of that as soon as possible? Because time is short. Amen? Amen. And so I hope this encourages you to think a little bit longer on the long game. We're so attention short here. We just, it's all about today. But there's something more coming our way, and we need to be mindful of that. And so, hey, let me pray for you as we close this little series, and hopefully this is something for you to think about. Father, I just want to pray that you would help each one of us recognize that what we're doing today may not seem super important, but it might have eternal consequences. What we're not doing and what we are doing could be affecting our kids and our family in ways that we're not even aware of. Help us to snap out of the coma that we get in and just kind of dialing it in and going through the motions. Help us to recognize that we have opportunities to live our faith out in front of our kids that will affect them in an incredible way and can maybe change the trajectory of our life. As I think about our marriages and recognize that maybe we want to get a divorce and we should just end this thing, there's something that could maybe be done that could help our kids press through when they find themselves in a difficult time. Because mom and dad have courage to push through and persevere. I don't know what it is, but I pray that you would just help us recognize those opportunities in our life to show faith, to model kindness, to model forgiveness, to model generosity, because it has the potential to change our future generations, God. God, I pray as we close this series on families that, as I do every day, I pray for our families. God, I pray for the marriages that are connected to this church, that you would help them be blessed, that you would help them navigate the troubles that are going on. I pray that you would remind our couples that the Jesus in her is the same Jesus that's in him, and that Jesus will agree with one another if we can get to that point. Help our families learn how to follow and live for Jesus. Help our kids, Lord, I pray as they travel and they go places and they do things in this town, that you would bubble wrap them and protect them from harm, and that you would help them grow up to know that there is a God that loves them and has a plan for them, even though things aren't always perfect, that they will go, you know what? God is with me. I saw it with my parents. They told me that God is with me. I'm believing them. And so I pray that you would help us to lead our families. We may never be perfect, but we will aim high and we'll do the best we can, even though we live in a broken and imperfect world, God. Bless our families, I pray. Bless these moms and dads. In Jesus' name I pray. And all God's children say amen.